Hey, what's going on, you guys? First of all, massive thank you to everyone that watched the Shadow of the Colossus video. I do plan on making a full breakdown of the animated opening that was at the start of that video. Despite that animation being just a little under 2 minutes long, that was several months of work. And one of the major reasons why, well, it's the model that you're seeing on screen right now. A lot went into this Colossus model that I've started calling Rudolph because I started making it in December and I showed it to a friend of mine and he called it that and I thought it was funny. I would say he's the largest model I've made, but I realized that's not true. I've made something larger than this, but it is the largest character model I've ever made so far. A lot of late nights went into making this thing, but if you want to see a full breakdown of the mechanical horse model or the animated avatar of this channel, you're in luck. I've already made videos on that. They should be in the cards and probably on screen right now. You can check those out after watching this one. Okay, enough blatant shilling. This video will be a mix of time-lapse and commentary. I'll hop in at points and give you guys some insight. Let's go. So, believe it or not, I'm actually really bad at drawing, so I didn't start with a sketch or anything. Also, I need to get my drawing tablet replaced, but that's a whole other can of worms. I had some ideas in my head that I started jotting down on a piece of paper that I'm pretty sure I tossed in the trash somewhere, because now I can't find it. Oh well. I had 3 ideas for the Colossus model. One was gonna be a bipedal creature with horns and some sort of weapon like a hammer or a club, but I thought that'd be too similar to ones already in the game, so I wasn't keen on doing that. The second was a giant serpent creature similar to the 7th and 13th Colossi, but it would be airborne, and it would somehow generate like a thunderstorm around it, and it would weave in and out of the clouds. I scrapped that because making clouds that looked convincing would mean volumetrics, which would mean the renders would be really noisy, which means I'd have to up the noise samples to denoise it, and it would just take longer to render. And I'd also have to set up convincing rain and have it reacting with most of the objects in the scene. Plus, what I really wanted was something that would tower over Observer on the horse, and having something that's floating doesn't really do that. Like, it probably would have still looked cool, but I just think it would lose the whole, this giant thing is looking at you, or towering over you. But the last idea, it actually came to me while I was walking through a wooded area one day. I just thought, wouldn't it have been cool to have a Colossus that you fought in a giant forest clearing or something? And I started thinking, what animals would I associate with the woods? And the answer that jumped out to me was a deer. A buck, to be specific. I had this image in my head of a giant stone buck-like creature with massive antlers that are just caked in moss and ivy. Thought that would stand out pretty well. The first step was the blockout phase and trying to get the general shape of it, to then refine later, which you can see me doing for a while here. I'm going to put down the mic for a bit and just let the sped up footage speak for itself. Once I had gotten the general shape, I started refining things. As you saw, I spent a lot of time working on the head, because it took me a while to find a good reference for getting the basic shape that I like. Because originally I was going to try and make it look more like a deer skull, but that was a little complicated, so I just tried to get the general idea or shape of it down. I don't know why I didn't black out the horns too from the start. Probably should have done that. But one thing you'll notice with the Colossi is they all seem to have these like architectural elements incorporated into them. So I had the idea of making Rudolph's ribcage a bunch of arches, like they were lifted from a temple somewhere. I don't know, I think it's pretty cool. I don't think you see it very much in the full animation, which is a shame, but oh well. It is what it is. But this also led me to try and add more structures across the body to hide the basic shapes, which is why it has temples on its hind legs. Pretty sure I used the entrance to number 6's layer as a reference for that one. But I came back to working on it again, and I was focusing on some basic detailing and refinement. Drew a lot of inspiration from the third Colossus too, as I started adding these totem looking things that were just jutting out of the body like he has. I ran into a problem later with the totem spikes on the back. I was trying to arrange them so it would be like vertebrae, but when it came to rigging, something went wrong there, but we aren't quite there yet, and I'm still not 100% sure what the issue is. I have some ideas though, but I'll come back to that later. So I just kept messing around with it and kept refining it. I changed the feet because I didn't like the original look for them, and I added structures to the legs to break up their basic shape. I tried messing around with just adding details to other parts, and some of those I ended up scrapping because they just didn't look right or they didn't fit. I did mess around with the idea of giving it a more defined tail, but it just didn't work very well, and then I just realized that instead of making the tail a separate thing, I could just shape the back of the body to resemble a tail. I also just added more details across it so it didn't look like a bunch of blobby shapes put together. But I kept making passes and taking breaks and zooming out and rotating the model to make sure things look right from afar. But at one point, I then realized, oh yeah, I still haven't added the horns yet, so I found a good reference image and started modeling them, which turned out a lot easier than I thought it would. I was expecting that to be a headache. Texturing is usually one of those things with modeling that I find enjoyable and pretty easy, usually. This wasn't one of those cases. Trying to get the stone texture the way I want it to look took a while. The easiest part were the eyes. I ended up finding a pretty high-res close-up of one of the Colossi faces, and then I added a circle into the eye socket, and then took that image and made it a texture, and then set it so it only showed the eye. I then set up a way to add orange to the eyes so I could animate them changing color when it's angered. The hardest part was trying to add more details into the stone. Because if you look up a lot of the Colossi, there's a lot of detail and shapes carved into the stone. It isn't just, flat stone textures in a lot of places. And it's actually wild how much detail they were able to add when you consider the hardware limitations of the PS2. Some techno wizardry going on there. I wasn't recording, but to try and add more detail, I opened a new Blender file and I took a cube and I just started adding a bunch of shapes onto it, and then making that black and white, and I took a picture of it and turned it into a bump map. A bump map, just giving a real brief crash course, is something that tells a shader to simulate different wrinkles or raised sections. Black means flat and white means raised. You can kind of think of it as like a 1 and 0 type of thing. You can mess around with a bump map. You can even invert it if you want to. Anyway, going back to this, it didn't work as well as I would have hoped, but from afar, it doesn't look that bad. I also played around with trying to make it look like it was covered in moss by adding green into the rock. And I also added some more variation by including dirt colors, just to make the stone look more varied and detailed, because this thing is an ancient creature that's been sitting here exposed to the elements for who knows how long. It should look aged and weathered. I made some variations on the stone texture, and I made one that was more green for the horns, and I also applied it to some other parts of the model just to give it some more color. I was trying to make it look like it was just caked in moss, but it didn't come across that well. So I just settled on it just being a greener rock. I also went and added more details on the face to make it look a little meaner and to make it look a little more detailed, because I felt it was looking a little under detailed. I spent a good amount of time on texturing, and while texturing it, that revealed some areas I wasn't happy with, so I went to fix those too. I also added fur. I just used a basic hair particle sim and just put a grassy texture on it. I don't think I got footage of this, but I added a plane in spots and then found a PNG or the marker symbol from the game and put it on there. And then assigned those planes to the head and chest and made it glow blue so it had actual weak points on it. I did mess around with adding vines to it, and I did figure out a way to do it, but I made a mistake and had all the vines as one object, despite them covering different parts of the body. And because of that, if I tried to make them move with the model, it would have been a nightmare. It also raised the poly count pretty high, which I was a little worried about since I had to, put this thing in an environment, so I ended up scrapping that. This took a while, and this is one of the parts whenever I'm making a 3D model I dread the most, because rigging is definitely one of my biggest weaknesses, but somehow this one wasn't that awful. It was just slightly painful. It has some jank though, especially with the legs and the totems on the back. For some reason, they move when they shouldn't. I assume they're somehow being manipulated by a bone they're not supposed to be, but I've yet to figure out which one is causing the problem. The inverse kinematics on the legs also acted funny, but it wasn't a huge deal. Either way, I was able to get it to work with what I needed to do here, so not too bad. So that's everything that went into Rudolph's model. I'll have a video up doing a breakdown of all the shots and animation, and the transition scenes later. If you liked the video, please consider leaving a like and a comment, and checking out the other behind the scenes videos on animations, including the opening animation I did for my Doom 2016 video. That was a lot smaller and less complicated than this one, but it was a ton of fun too. Again, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who watched the Shadow of the Colossus video, and thank you to whoever watched all of this. I'm going to start work on the Doom 64 video soon, and I'll have it out this month. So stay tuned for that, and have a good one.